I'm Bill Kassel, and this is Free Expression. This program is all about conveying the Christian message from a Catholic point of view and defending the liberty which makes it possible to do that. We look at books about two remarkable bishops, one a great communicator and the other a martyr to the great sex scandal. Join us, sit back and enjoy some free expression. Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen has to be considered one of the greatest Christian communicators of all time. He was a prolific author, a powerful speaker and homilist, a pioneer of religious broadcasting. I can recall watching him on TV back in the 50s and 60s. His presentations were always clear and understandable, even to a kid like me who wasn't even Catholic in those days. Sheen's unique gifts made him extraordinarily effective as a shepherd and as a recoverer of lost sheep. The list of people who can cite him as a major factor in their conversions or their return to the church is long and impressive. Dr. Cheryl Hughes is a scholar of religious history. She has a new book, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker, from Ignatius Press. And she's here to tell us about it. Dr. Hughes, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
How did this Illinois priest become such a communications powerhouse?
Well, I think it helps to be the first kid on the block, perhaps. He was on radio for 25 years before he went on television, so the whole country was really aware of him. When television came on, finally, he joined it right in the very beginning. It was just the infancy of television, and he just took it by storm. I think because he was so personal. He seemed like you were the only one. He was sitting in your living room, or you were sitting in his den, and you were having a nice conversation about something that he was, carrying along himself, telling jokes, but also spreading the gospel and being very attentive to audience and audience needs. Very, very respectful, I think, to audiences.
He was a fabulous presenter. You're right. He had a certain personal touch that was very, very vivid. I think people were able to identify with him, even non-Catholics like myself. But how did he get into radio? How did the whole communications thing begin?
He was asked to join radio. I don't know if you remember Father Coughlin on the radio.
Yes.
Father Coughlin was the first Catholic on the airwaves of radio. And as time went on, he became more and more eccentric and more political.
And extremely controversial.
Extremely controversial. Most religious programming was done either late at night or really, really early in the morning. There were some evangelical preachers on there, and the main radio stations were not happy with either one of those, either the Protestants or the Catholics. And so they actually came to the diocese in New York City and said, can you recommend a speaker for us who can state the Catholic faith and at the same time not be so eccentric as Coughlin was, who was driving people away. I mean, calling everybody fascists, and he was really just sort of a disaster. And finally, his bishop called him off of the radio and assigned him to some backwater parish. But Sheen just took off. He was part of, it wasn't the Bishop Sheen show, it was part of the Catholic Hour, and it was a weekly program. And he was the main speaker most of the time, not exclusively, but because he was so popular, it came to be thought of as his program.
He gained a tremendous visibility. He was unique. He was on the networks. He won an Emmy Award. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine. For a Catholic priest to become such a celebrity was very unusual.
Well, he was a brilliant man. And he was humble in his way, and he was also absolutely sincere about what he had to say. And I think that really won him over. When people could actually see him, he had riveting eyes. People said it was like looking into the eyes of God. His eyes were so riveting. Sometimes we would get a full-face view of him in their living room. So it just seemed like he was coming to them personally. And I think that that personal touch just really caught fire with the country. And as you say, it caught people up that whether they were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or nothing.
Right.
They found something to like in Bishop Sheen because he made so much good sense.
I remember as a kid being fascinated with the cape he wore. I thought it made him look like a superhero.
Well, the cool thing about the cape, for one thing, it gave him more bulk. I don't know if you realize he was a man of short stature. He was probably 5'7", maybe 5'8" on a very proud day. And so his regalia on television helped him to look bigger. They also, of course, had the camera slightly looking up at him, making him look taller.
Right.
So there are lots of little tricks that one could do with the camera to enhance his position. But still, it was him. He was a guy in a skirt saying things that were extremely welcome to the public at large.
Well, now your book focuses particularly on the converts that he made. Who were some of the most prominent people that came into his orbit?
Claire Booth Luce was, I think, the brightest star in his firmament. We don't know who she is today, but she was married to Henry Luce, who owned Time Magazine and that whole Time Inc. She was an author. She wrote plays. She wrote screenplays. Some of her plays were made into movies. She was a congresswoman from Connecticut, and then she became an ambassador to Italy. I mean, she was very, very well known, and actually a personal advisor to every president except for Jimmy Carter, which was kind of unusual. So she was a big star, and when he got her, that was very impressive to people, and that woke up the people, say, in Hollywood, so we got to also convert some people in Hollywood, including Virginia Mayo. Virginia Mayo was a beautiful young woman. The leader of Morocco said that looking at Virginia Mayo gave proof that there is a God. And there was another one who was utterly delightful, and I'm sorry we don't know more about her. I really would like to write a screenplay about her. Her name was Bricktop, at least that was her nickname. Her name was Ada Smith, and Ada Smith was born of a woman who had an ex-slave and an Irish grandfather who gave her red hair. And so she was called Bricktop for her red hair. And she called herself a saloon owner. She owned various clubs and whatnot. And she was very, very big and popular in Paris between World War I and World War II. Interestingly, she was a radio convert of his. She did not take instructions from him, but she listened to his programs, and they made so much sense that she went and found a Catholic priest to receive her into the church. And later they did meet and became really fast friends for years and years and years.
Probably the most notorious figure would have been Bella Dodd, who was a communist operative, and she underwent an amazing conversion, as I understand.
Yes, Bella Dodd was active in the unions, the teachers' union particularly. She also was eventually thought the Communist Party was out to kill her, and they probably were. And so she took refuge in the Catholic Church. Sheen, in fact, converted her, received her into the church. But she was a very flawed individual, flawed personality, quite unstable. And ultimately, she failed at being a Catholic. So the ex-communist who was an ex-Catholic eventually became almost a non-person and died in obscurity in New York.
With all the people he met, I guess he moved in circles that would have put him in contact with these folks. Some, as you say, I guess were drawn to him by seeing him on TV. And how did other people happen to come into his circle?
Well, he said that he would give instructions to anybody who wanted them. In the case of Louis Boudin's, another communist who was the editor of the Daily Worker, he wanted to leave the Communist Party. It took him about 8 years to get that straight in his mind, but to finally do it. And he wanted to bring his wife and daughters into it. And Sheen said that he would fly to New York to be with Margaret Boudin's, to give her instructions. He would fly to her wherever he was. He would be there. I mean, he was that dedicated to winning souls.
Now, there is a cause for his canonization, as I understand. Where does all of that stand?
Well, it's somewhat on hold as far as I understand it. He is considered venerable, and he has the required miracle attributed to him of a stillborn child who, after an hour or more, actually came to life.
Really?
After the parents prayed to Fulton Sheen to cure the baby. He was all set to be beatified, and somebody from the Diocese of Rochester, New York, suggested that there might have been some impropriety in how he handled some, perhaps, sexual predator's case in Rochester, that he didn't do enough. So that actually stopped things like a day or two before the beatification was supposed to come off. And it's been in limbo ever since. Though they did research, they found there was absolutely nothing to what that allegation was. And so now, as I understand it, it's up to the bishops in the United States, our USCCB, to finally push for canonization for him.
Well, where can people go to find out more about your book and purchase it?
You can get it from Ignatius Press, and it's probably in most Catholic bookstores.
Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, convert maker, Cheryl Hughes, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much. Take care. God bless.
The Great Sex Abuse Scandal was one of the most traumatizing incidents in the modern church. What started as an effort to right unrecognized wrongs grew into a virtual inquisition that swept up many innocent priests and church workers, along with some genuine predators. Cardinal George Pell was one of the prominent figures charged. The late Archbishop of both Sydney and Melbourne, this Australian prelate was accused of personal abuse as well as ignoring the sins of others. He was imprisoned, even serving more than 400 days in solitary confinement. His conviction was finally overturned by Australia's highest court. Australian journalist Tess Livingstone has written a definitive biography, George Pell, Pax Invictus, new from Ignatius Press. Tess, thanks so very much for taking time to share Cardinal Pell's story.
You're very welcome, Bill. It's a big book, but then it was a very big life.
Could you give us a little background on Cardinal Pell for the benefit of an American audience that might not be all that familiar with him?
Absolutely, Bill. Cardinal Pell was born in the Victorian regional town of Ballarat, which is about 60 miles away from Melbourne, the capital city. And he had a pretty carefree country childhood in Australia. His parents ran a pub, a hotel in the town. He was a good scholar and at his lessons, like most Australian kids, but he was just better at it. His big love and interest was sport. He did very well with his sport at school. He played cricket, tennis, swimming, but the game he cared about most was Australian rules football. And in his last year of school, in year 12, he was offered a professional football contract by one of the really big teams of the time. It was a very tempting offer.
Really? Now, how did he get into the priesthood?
Cardinal Pell felt a calling to the priesthood about halfway through his final year at school, year 12. Unlike a lot of priests, he didn't have that desire early on. In fact, he fought the idea for quite a long time. It troubled him in year 12. And he went and spoke to one of his teachers, and he would have been very happy to be told, no, you're not suited to that. Go and play football or take up your scholarship to Melbourne University to study law. But the teacher was wiser than that. He saw he was ideally suited and that the young man probably had a genuine vocation which he needed to try out. And in typical Pell style, he thought about it and then he said, all right, I'll have a go.
Now, he served in numerous capacities. He was a parish priest. He worked his way all the way up to a bishop and then an archbishop, and eventually he wound up in the Vatican.
He had vast experience in many areas. He studied in both Australia and Rome and in Oxford, where he did a doctorate in church history. And he did a short stint, too, doing pastoral work in Baltimore, which was very interesting. And when he came back to Australia in about 1971, he worked as a curate in a country parish. He enjoyed pastoral work very much. He'd always had a talent for it, which was obvious when he was in Oxford, and he used to minister to a lot of priests, a lot of parishes around the district. Then he was the founder of the Ballarat Teachers College, which became one of the parts of the Australian Catholic University, which is a national institution that he was instrumental in founding. And then his first step really onto the career ladder came in the 1980s when he was appointed rector of the seminary in Melbourne. And that was a pretty controversial gig because he thought things were going wrong in the seminary and he set about reforming it. And then from there, Bill, he became an auxiliary bishop, and he was an auxiliary bishop to Sir Frank Little in Melbourne for 9 years, and they were very big years. He headed the Australian aid agency, Caritas, that donated very generously to third world countries, and in our part of the world, that was largely the Philippines, Cambodia, after the ravages of Pol Pot, Vietnam. He went to India after catastrophic earthquakes. That 9 years was extraordinary. He also, in that time, made contact with the underground church in China. So they were very, very big years, and not for the first time in his career, and certainly not the last. He was called on to do some major reform work there. In the Philippines, some of the Catholic aid, unfortunately, had been diverted to communist groups. So he had to sort all that out. So he had quite a career by the time he became Archbishop of Melbourne in 1996.
Now, his penchant for looking into things and bringing about reforms eventually put him into the Vatican Secretariat for the Economy. He served as the prefect for that.
It did, Bill. That came after serving for 6 years as Archbishop of Melbourne and serving on the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under then Cardinal Ratzinger, and serving as Archbishop of Sydney for 13 years. And Pope Francis, in one of his really excellent appointments, appointed George Pell prefect for the economy in the Vatican because there was a massive reform job to be done in terms of accountability, transparency, and just instilling some competence into the process. The incompetence he found in the Vatican was just extraordinary. There were dozens of properties that no rent was being collected on. There was no list of precious Vatican artworks. Each department had its own finances. There was no overall picture of the Vatican finances. The pension fund was in danger of running out of money at some point. There was no proper auditing going on, but look, unfortunately, Bill, when he tried to appoint an external audit firm, the old guard in the Vatican absolutely kicked up against that move, and they weren't too pleased when he appointed an internal auditor, Libero Maloney. So that was a huge battle. He had fought there for a couple of years. His telephones were bugged. His office was broken into. People made it very clear they were not happy with the reform process.
And as a result of all that, a lot of rumors have circulated that these sexual charges may have been instigated or at least influenced by some of the enemies he was making in Rome. Do you think that there's any truth to that?
Yeah, those rumors have certainly been around, Bill. Look, I can say this for sure. They were not instigated from Rome at that time. The very bizarre investigation into Cardinal Pell was begun by police in Victoria in 2013 before he went to Rome. Now, what role subsequent events with his work in Rome played in the process, I don't know. Cardinal Pell himself was open on that question and would love to have known the answers, and many people have tried to find out. He certainly made some very intense enemies, not just inside the church, but outside it. There were hundreds of accounts he closed at the Vatican Bank that he suspected were being used by all sorts of groups, possibly even the mafia, for money laundering. So there was no shortage of wrongdoers lining up against him, and people in Rome were very pleased to see the back of him when he elected to return to Australia to face those charges, false as they were. He wanted to clear his name. He could have claimed diplomatic immunity and stayed in Rome, but it wasn't his nature to do that.
Now, there were actually 2 cases involved in these sexual complaints. Give us the picture of all of that. What happened, what charges were brought, and how did that whole thing unfold?
The charges that went to trial, it was called the Cathedral Trial. What the allegation was that very early on in his time as Archbishop of Melbourne, probably in one of his first masses he said at the Cathedral, which had been closed for renovations, that then Archbishop Pell found 2 choir boys in the sacristy after Mass having a bit of a swig of the altar wine, and that he took the opportunity to abuse the 2 of them. The problem with that theory, Bill, is that most people knew that Archbishop Pell's practice was to stand outside the church for 15, 20 minutes, even half an hour, and talk to people, to stand at the back of the cathedral. And the other thing is, in the sacristy at the time, there were priests coming and going, there were altar servers coming and going, people putting candlesticks and sacred vessels away. It really never seemed very plausible, and if anyone cares to look at Cardinal Pell's police interview, which is on YouTube, he absolutely dismissed it as nonsense, absolute erroneous nonsense. But possibly he and others took it too lightly. The charges got through the lower courts, and then they got to trial. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and he was found guilty in the second trial. So the judge, under Australian law, had no alternative but to impose a custodial sentence, and Cardinal Pell went to jail for 404 days, most of which had to be spent in solitary confinement for his own protection. It was a very difficult situation.
Eventually, the conviction was overturned by the High Court of Australia.
It was, yes. His first appeal to the Victorian Court of Appeal was lost 2-1, but then he took his case to the High Court of Australia, which would be equivalent to taking it to the Supreme Court here in the United States. And the judges ruled 7-0 in his favour. It was totally definitive, and people sort of wonder how it ever got as far as it did.
There was such, I would almost describe it as a frenzy when the sex scandal broke. It seemed like people were finding sex abuse under every rock. Do you think that he was caught up in all of that, that maybe people just...
I think it influenced attitudes. I didn't attend the trial every day, much of which was closed, actually, but on a couple of days when I did go there, I spoke to a few people while we were waiting to go back in after lunch and things like that, and I just casually said to them, "Do you think he's guilty?" And quite a number of people said to me, "No, I don't think he did it, but he deserves to go to jail anyway for what the church did." So there was a bit of a scapegoat mentality there. Look, there was intense anger, Bill, at the behaviour of a small minority of priests, and it's cost the church very dearly, not just financially, which it should, but in terms of its reputation. But it's the same thing has subsequently come out about sporting organisations, other bodies, even the Salvation Army. It's a national, indeed international problem where some of the main perpetrators are in family homes, unfortunately. But look, for the church and its reputation, it's been absolutely diabolic. It's slowly rebuilding its credibility with some strong checks and balance processes, which incidentally Cardinal Pell was in the forefront of putting in place. But, yeah, it was a terribly shameful episode for the church.
In that perspective, would you consider Cardinal Pell a martyr?
A white martyr?
Yes.
Look, I think no matter how bad, and he admitted to, we had a royal commission, that's a big government inquiry into child sex abuse in Australia, not just the churches, but everywhere. He admitted in a couple of cases that he could and should have done more, but that doesn't in any way justify bringing false charges against him or his having to spend 400 days towards the end of his life in jail. The charges that were brought against him came about after a police operation called Operation Tethering that began in 2013 when there were actually no complaints against him. The police started an investigation to see if they could find any. Look, it was an extraordinary atmosphere, and I just can't emphasise enough how traumatic the whole issue has been for Catholics and indeed all Australians.
How was his life after all of that?
Very calm. He was hugely relieved to be exonerated by the High Court because it restored his reputation. He was 80 years old by then. He turned 80 when he was in jail. And then when he came out, he lived for a while in Sydney, and then he went back to Rome. He took an intense interest in church events. He wrote some very interesting memos about the direction the church was heading in, called Demos, but he was at peace. When he was in jail, he wrote 3 journals called the prison journals, and he made it clear there that he didn't understand what had happened to him, but he accepted it as the will of God, and he bore no grudges, and he'd forgiven all his enemies, and he was very calm and at peace. And that's, the title of the book, Pax Invictus, Peace to the Unconquered, because he was basically unconquered in the end, but he was also at peace. But he died sooner than any of us expected.
Tess Livingstone, George Pell, Pax Invictus from Ignatius Press. Where can people find out more about the book?
The best place to find out about it is on the Ignatius Press website. That's ignatius.com, or they can order it from Amazon, or they can ask their local Catholic bookstore to order some copies in.
Well, thanks very much for sharing all of this with us. It's a fascinating, if disturbing, story that people really should know about.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for your interest in it. I'm fascinated by the interest in Cardinal Pell and the knowledge about him here in the United States. He often came to lecture here, and he clearly made a very big impression.
Be with us next time when we explore other aspects of religious communication and look deeper into the great Christian heritage of free expression. Free Expression with Bill Kassel is a production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio and Company Publications, where good books, good music, and good radio are always good company. Dan Curris provided technical assistance. Theme and incidental music are by Dan Adam. The program was produced and directed by Bill Kassel. This is Good Shepherd Catholic Radio.